Why don't we move on to the, technology more generally? I know you've been involved in thinking about technology for Congress in a more broad sense. It's also something we're very interested in looking at. Can you talk about what you've done in that space? What do you see? What are the problems and what are the potential solutions?
So, as my colleagues and I have been working on this kind of technology for constituent engagement, we've been kind of surprised that there hasn't been a whole lot of uptake of our ideas among the offices that we've worked with. And it's a little bit strange because you can talk to every single member of Congress will tell you that they are looking for good ways to kind of learn the insights and views of their constituents. And so it's a little bit weird that we have a really good solution. And we actually, just thinking about my earlier work, we have very good evidence that our solution works well. But it's hard to get members of Congress to kind of change the way that they've always done things. And in our case, we really had a hard time getting them to think about how to use technology in a kind of a more productive and constructive way. About the time, a couple of years ago, when the House of Representatives created the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress at the beginning of the previous Congress, the American Political Science Association, which is our main professional association, created something they called the Presidential Task Force on Congressional Reform. They asked me to serve on that, and they asked me to chair the Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation. And the reason they asked me, it was actually Francis Lee and Eric Schickler, but I know you've had Francis, and maybe you've had Eric on this.
He's in the queue.
Okay, yeah. So they were the co-chairs of the committee, and they appointed me to be the chair of the Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation because they knew that I had been through this kind of weird experience of not having a lot of success with technology in Congress. And so I worked with, there was a whole committee, but there was the writing group was me and Marcy Harris, who's at Popbox, and Claire Abernathy, who's a professor at Stockton University in New Jersey. And so the three of us were a writing team, and we ended up spending most of a year trying to diagnose what the barrier was, what prevented Congress from making effective use of technology in its work. And it wasn't just, our example was just one example, but you could talk to anybody who's worked in a congressional office and ask them about their constituent relations management software that they use. And you can picture it sort of like that scene in Network where everybody runs to the window and yells, I can't take it anymore. That's kind of that the CRM software is just terrible. And it's weird because that's how they manage constituent relations. So you think they would do that really well. And there's kind of a long list of things that Congress doesn't make effective use of technology in its workflow and its day-to-day work. And so we spent some time thinking about, well, what's the barrier? What's preventing Congress from embracing technology and making the use of using technology more effectively? And what we settled on was that the main problem in Congress is it's very decentralized. And so you have the 441 individual offices and 20 standing committees and a dozen support agencies. And pretty much all of them are their own kind of fiefdom. So each member runs their office, each committee chair runs their committee, right? The support agencies are pretty independent. And it turns out that that if you look at Congress as a whole, that there isn't kind of an office that's responsible for kind of deploying technology across the whole institution. And instead, each office and each committee and each support agency was really on its own to make its own technology purchasing decisions. And so Congress, because of its kind of radical decentralization and how it uses technology, there wasn't really any opportunity for kind of the accumulation of kind of learning best practices about using technology. Because if say one of the offices that we worked with really liked their experience, there wasn't any way for them to tell other offices you should do the same thing. And so any lessons that were learned would kind of dissipate in this really decentralized structure. So that's what we kind of diagnosed the problem. And our solution is to try to we're recommending to Congress to create an entity that would kind of solve that. So not to put in like an IT office, but to put in a kind of a central task force that would enable collaboration across offices, so they could kind of brainstorm about best practices and share best practices with each other. So that was kind of our recommendation for how to solve it. Yeah.
And were there any kind of, besides constituent software, were there any other areas that you saw were crying out for some kind of centralized solution?
Well, the task force was before COVID, and with once the Congress shut down, they found that they were really ill-equipped to deal with remote work. So they didn't have ways to kind of sign dear colleague letters digitally, right? That in fact, that was just solved the other day, that it used to be that staff would have to walk a letter around to every office and get a physical signature. But just all of the things that we take for granted with video conferencing. So committees really started only in the past year really started experimenting with using video conferencing like Zoom in committee hearings. There's right, so things that we take for granted, they really didn't make almost any use of. So video conferencing or collaboration tools like collaboration, kind of like, we all use Google Docs and collaboration tools, and there was just really none of that. And our report has kind of an extensive listing of all of the kind of dysfunctions. But what was interesting was that COVID, the shutdown from the pandemic really forced Congress to innovate and kind of pushed Congress to get kind of much more in line with modern technology than they had in the past. So, yeah.
Was there anything specific? I mean, obviously for the members, there's this whole constituent service side of things. What about in the committees? Since you spent more time thinking about committees, is there specific software or technology that committees should be using that would increase their productivity or, increase their collaborative capabilities?
Well, I think it's really important for committees to make better use of both synchronous and asynchronous conferencing. So synchronous would be to have hearings done and have virtual hearings where you could have experts from anywhere come in and give testimony. And they've done that. And also to have kind of asynchronous sort of opportunities for people to go onto a website and to mark up them and to comment on legislation, but to do it, not to have to do it all at once, but people could do it kind of asynchronously, right? And to kind of collaborate on that in that way. So I think committees could do a much better job with that.
Got it. And what about in terms of leadership? One area that's been talked about that always surprises me is that there's not an automated kind of calendaring system, for committee work. I don't know. Did you have any recommendations around leadership and how to, make the calendar more productive, since time ultimately is the most important thing Congress has?
So there was a separate subcommittee that worked on calendaring. So I'd have to refer you to them on that. But we actually, in our report, we did document kind of lots of examples of the Congress's ineffective use of technology, but we were actually pretty careful not to make lots of recommendations in our report for kind of technology or solutions that Congress should use, because what we're mindful of is it's really important for Congress to solve this underlying organizational dysfunction that prevents them from making the effective use of technology before they then start thinking about, well, what technology should we use? Because if they don't do that, if they just kind of go out and buy a bunch of new apps, right, or download a bunch of new apps, they would just be layering new technology on an inefficient organization. In fact, that's what Eric Schickler's his own work, his early work about congressional reform was really important to us in our work, was really being mindful of that Congress has, time and again in its history, has tried to kind of reform itself by just layering new solutions on top of the inefficient structure that they were trying to resolve. And yeah, so what we recommended was for Congress to have a better process for thinking about how to use technology and to develop their capacity for using technology, and to really think about those processes. And if they could plug those processes in place, then that process could find what solutions would make sense. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, one of the problems with any change in process, of which technology is a kind, right? It's going to benefit some compared to others, right? It might strengthen leadership versus your average member. It might strengthen a committee in relation to the leader. So I'm sure that's a very delicate balancing act you have to go through when you're thinking about process change, and technology is probably a kind of process change.
A big question there this past year was the remote voting business, right? That's which is a really important. It was important at the time, but it's also really important for continuity. That if there is like the next pandemic we have, or if there's some catastrophe, we really need to have some solution for remote voting. And there was a lot of that's an example, I think, where there's kind of institutional winners and losers, and that didn't really take off. But mostly but there's a lot of technology for constituent engagement is an area where there's no caucus in Congress that wants to protect bad technology for working with constituents. There's not a single one of them that wants that. So we the way we wrote our report was to say, well, at least figure out how to get a process in place that can help you do what every single one of you wants to do, and at least start with that. And then maybe, and then I think if Congress can develop better capacity to engage technology, then it would be in it would be better equipped then to figure out how to tackle these bigger questions, right? That at least they would have that capacity in place, and then they could decide what made sense for them. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think it's time for us to move on to what we call our lightning round, where we ask questions, the same questions to all of our guests, so that someday we can compare the answers. Are you ready to move on to that section?
I'm ready.
All right. The first question is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
So I think that congressional representation should supplement the voice of interest groups with the voice of individuals, and that they both should be valued, and that representatives ultimately are oriented towards representing the voice of their community.
And that representation means what? Is it they do exactly what their constituents say they want them to do, or is it they're making judgments about what they think the interests of their constituents are?
So the best book to read about congressional representation is Richard Fenno's book called Homestyle, where he had this idea that an effective representative builds trust with their with his or her constituents, where they have enough trust and that they feel that they have enough leeway to use their judgment and discretion. So members of Congress have much better information about the effects of policies and the consequences of policies than the rest of us do, because that's their job. And so what they need to do is to create trust with their constituents that they're using their better knowledge and their judgment in a way that helps the community. And that it can happen that representatives, if they have trust, and this was the big insight in Fenno's book, is that if they have the trust of their constituents, they can actually vote on policies or write policies that constituents might think is contrary to their interest, but they're able to explain why they did so in a way that makes sense to constituents, and constituents recognize the limits of their own understanding and give their member of Congress leeway to do that. And that makes for kind of leverages what's good about representative government is that you're able to leverage the kind of knowledge that representatives have in a way that advances the interests of communities.
Since you had such a considered answer, I'm going to ask a layer down to see where you come out on the future, because I think obviously you've got your constituency is full of individuals today, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 generations down. Who's representing them? Is it the current representative? Should a representative be considering those future interests or just those who exist in his district today?
So, I think in the end, a good representative is going to have a moral grounding in what they think is right and wrong, and that so it's not just they don't just do what their constituents demand of them, but they do what they think is right. And thinking about the consequence of today's policies on future generations, that sort of understanding what that is really matters quite a bit, right? In a moral sense about what we should and shouldn't do. And representatives should have their kind of use their moral compass to make decisions about that, to use expertise, what they learn from what their constituents are telling them, but also just what they understand about policies, and then to guide their decision making based on their own moral grounding.
How much time should they spend in Washington versus in their hometown?
So I actually think that because of changes in technology and Congress's more recent embrace of the use of remote technology, that distinction is becoming less pressing, that they can, and so what I'd like to see is for Congress to make more effective use of communication technology in its workflow, so that members, even when they're in their district, they can do committee work. And even when they're in DC, they can do constituency work. That's what I would like to see is for Congress to make effective use of technology so that there isn't that same distinction. And to the extent that's true, right, then I would want to see members to balance their time. That being in the district is vital for them to understand their communities, to be connected to their communities. But nowadays, especially, it's really important for members to find to develop personal relationships with each other, and then especially if they could develop personal relationships with legislators from the other party, is something that's somewhat lacking now, and I would like to see a lot more of that. And I think it's very hard to develop those interpersonal relationships using remote technology. I think that there's limits to what remote technology can do. So I think it's important for members to kind of balance that they do both. But I think the time in DC is actually really important if they're willing to invest their time in trying to build interpersonal relations with their colleagues.
So what percent?
All right, I will go, I'm just gonna say with the caveat that they can do district work when they're in DC and DC work when they're in district, that I would say maybe half and half.
Half and half, okay. And what about in terms of legislation versus kind of like oversight work? Do you have a thought about that breakdown?
Well, they're connected. They're both important, right? So oversight is not separate from policy making. I guess for that it would really depend on the committee and the agency that they're and the policy topic. So I don't think I can give a generic answer to that. But oversight is really critical nowadays, especially because Congress has really disinvested in itself and its capacity over the last couple of decades. But the executive branch really has not. And so the executive branch has kind of extensive capacity to engage in policymaking in a way that Congress cannot. And so oversight in some ways is Congress's best bet to really try to harness that and to make sure that the policies we actually live under that are created by agencies are ones that are responsive to our interests. But I'm not going to give a breakdown. I think they're both really important.
Great. All right. Next one is how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress? And I don't mean with the constituents, I mean between the members and senators.
So, okay, so what I'd like to see is for uh, members to get better at speaking across their differences. And they're not really incentivized to do that um, in today's party system. And I understand that. But at the same time, Congress is a workplace where they work together, they're colleagues with each other. And I do think it's possible for members of Congress to develop better interpersonal relations across the aisle that then could lead to more constructive discussions. Even if they're not incentivized by the party system, they would be incentivized to do so by the institution. But the problem is that Congress is so thoroughly partisan in the sense of it being driven by the party leadership and partisanship within the institution, that members find that they don't really have a lot of opportunities to see each other, to kind of actually get to know each other across the aisle. So they do, their orientation is separately, and they caucus separately, and there aren't really a lot of opportunities for them to socially interact with each other. So I think if there was a way for Congress to kind of build in more social interaction among the members, then the institution would itself create some incentives for them to get better at speaking across their differences and maybe finding some areas of common ground.
And so where would that be? Would that be on the floor? Would that be in committee? Would that be, in the gym? Are they forced to have dinner together? How would you get them together to talk about these things? Where's the appropriate place for this kind of discussion dialogue?
Well, so the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress has been thinking about ways to do this, and things like bipartisan retreats would be helpful. I think having a meeting space, kind of like a lounge area in the Capitol. They're talking about where there are no TV cameras, but members from both parties could just be there and sit down and get a cup of coffee. I think the Select Committee itself has really modeled some really great behavior where they have Republicans and Democrats seated together on both sides. So that's not like Democrats on this side and Republicans on this side, but that they kind of mingle and they work together, and they work really hard at sort of building camaraderie across the parties within that committee. And so I think they've modeled some really good behavior too. So I think committees could probably do a better job of it as well. Yeah.
Great. Next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
Well, I would like them to embrace our recommendation to create the House Technology Working Group, which was this kind of body that we recommend that would build in sort of better collaboration across the different offices within the institution, so that there could be sort of more cross-institutional collaboration on effective technology. So I'd like to see them do that. And it's different. What our proposal was really different from a traditional IT office. And so an IT office, kind of like in Congress, there's something called House Information Resources, which is sort of like an IT office, but they're not as kind of regulatory as the one that we have at my university, or my wife's IT office at her hospital is like very regulatory, right? And so there's, so I'm not just talking about an IT office that helps them buy site licenses and make sure there's Wi-Fi, but that really there needs to be something that's not an IT office, but that's more a body of colleagues who can kind of talk to each other about best practices and kind of brainstorm sort of good ideas, share best practices, right, and to kind of collaborate on technology. And so it's different from just an IT office. And so that's what I'd like to see them to create the House Technology Working Group, which is our main recommendation.
All right. What book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
So the book that's been the most influential for me in thinking about Congress and my work on technology for constituent engagement is the one that I mentioned, Richard Fenno's book on home style. If you haven't read it, it came out in the 70s, but it's just beautiful, and it's really beautifully written. But I think the two books that mattered for the subcommittee on technology and innovation, the report that we wrote would be Jane Fountain's book on the virtual state, which looks at how public agencies, kind of what are the barriers within public agencies to adopt new technology that's different from the private sector. So there's a different set of barriers in the public sector. And then Eric Schickler's book on disjointed pluralism, where he looked at past episodes of congressional reform and what kind of worked and what didn't work. And sort of this idea that he found was that every time Congress tried to reform itself, it simply layered a new layer of reforms on top of the existing institutions and never really solved its problems. And so kind of Jane Fountain's book helped us to kind of diagnose the problem of kind of what the barriers were within a public agency. And then Eric Schickler's book was helpful for us to think about how to propose a recommendation that wasn't just kind of a Band-Aid, but that really got fundamentally at a way to make Congress better.
Great. Well, the last question is just about your plans for the future. What do you want to do in the long term with your work?
So my work on technology for constituent engagement has led to a new project that I've just started. So I got a grant from the Democracy Fund to build a new platform for deliberative online town halls. And so our work that we did, that I described to you before, made use of off-the-shelf technology, sort of webinar technology like Zoom webinar and those kinds of things. And so the best practices we developed were kind of built around the existing commercial solutions, but there's limitations to webinars are not a particularly good way to hold a town hall because they don't really enable the constituents to have kind of a feeling that they've had a robust or effective exchange, right? So webinars, you have kind of a chat function and a Q&A function, and that's it, right? And then and so what I'm doing is building a new platform that is called Protanium, and it hasn't been released yet, but it's still in development. That's going to create like a webinar tool, but one that enables constituents to engage in a much more robust and constructive way, and to kind of give real-time feedback to the speaker as they're speaking and ask questions and to comment on each other's questions. And so there'll be a much more robust set of tools for constituents to make sure that their voice is heard. And then there's also going to be tools built into it that will enable the moderator who's hosting the discussion to manage the questions that come in. So if a member of Congress holds a town hall, there might be 1,000 people on the town hall. If you have 1,000 questions coming in, it gets very unmanageable. And so we're building a lot of tools that help the moderator to curate the questions, but to do it in a way, both in terms of the constituent engagement side, right, and then the moderator and management side. The tools that we're building are designed with the purpose of trying to foster that more constructive, informed and constructive and robust exchange between members and constituents. And so all of the tools are kind of designed to kind of do the opposite of what Facebook does. It's designed to get people to come out of their echo chambers, right, to talk across their differences and to make sure that underrepresented voices get heard. And so those are the tools that we're trying to build into the platform. So and it will be the summertime will be kind of doing a soft launch of it this summer, and then hopefully it'll be something that people like.
Great. Well, Kevin, thanks so much for talking with us. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew.